June 23, 1956, 2:47 in the afternoon. Officer Frank DiMaggio's hand was shaking as he gripped Bumpy Johnson's wrist, trying to force the cuffs on. Around them, 125th Street had gone silent, storefronts emptied. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Within 60 seconds, over 300 people had formed a circle around the two men. DiMaggio had come with a warrant. He had backup waiting 2 blocks away. He had the full authority of the NYPD behind him, and none of it mattered.
Because as DiMaggio looked around at the faces surrounding him, the shoeshine boys, the numbers, runners, the grandmothers, the war veterans, the jazz musicians, he realized something that made his blood run cold. Every single one of them was ready to die for the man he was trying to arrest. Bumpy didn't struggle, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at DiMaggio with those calm, knowing eyes and said 6 words that would echo through Harlem for decades.
"You sure you want this smoke?" What nobody knew, what the history books won't tell you, is that Bumpy Johnson had been expecting this arrest for 3 weeks. And what he'd set in motion during those 3 weeks didn't just save him from prison, it changed the relationship between Harlem and the NYPD forever. But hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button real quick before we dive in. Trust me, this story is about to get wild.
To understand what happened on 125th Street that afternoon, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was in 1956. You need to understand what Harlem was going through. And you need to understand why one corrupt cop thought he could take down the most protected man in New York. By the mid-1950s, Harlem was in transition. The Great Migration had transformed it into the cultural capital of Black America, home to jazz clubs, intellectual movements, and dreams that couldn't exist anywhere else in the country. But with opportunity came predators. The NYPD had a particular relationship with Harlem in those days, and it wasn't protection. Certain officers had figured out that black communities were easy targets. They could shake down business owners, extort numbers runners, and brutalize citizens all without consequences. Internal Affairs didn't care what happened north of 110th Street. Enter Officer Frank DiMaggio. DiMaggio wasn't just corrupt, he was ambitious. The 34-year-old Italian cop had been working Harlem for 6 years, building a network of informants, collecting bribes from local businesses, and answering to people who weren't wearing badges.
Word on the street was that DiMaggio had connections to the Genovese family. He wasn't just a cop, he was their cop. And the Genovese family had a problem. His name was Bumpy Johnson. See, Bumpy had done something the Italian mob couldn't forgive. He'd organized Harlem. Before Bumpy, the neighborhood's numbers operation was scattered. Independent operators, paying tribute to whoever demanded it. Bumpy consolidated them. He created infrastructure.
He built a system where the money stayed in Harlem, where black business owners kept their profits, where the community controlled its own economy. The mob had tried everything to break Bumpy's hold on Harlem. They'd sent muscle. Bumpy sent it back broken. They'd tried negotiating. Bumpy told them Harlem wasn't for sale. They'd even attempted to work with him, to cut deals. Bumpy only dealt on his terms. But Bumpy wasn't just a businessman. He was Harlem's protector. When families couldn't make rent, Bumpy paid it. When store owners got shaken down by cops, Bumpy made phone calls that made the shakedowns stop. When young men needed jobs, Bumpy found them work. When the city tried to ignore Harlem's crumbling infrastructure, Bumpy funded repairs himself. The Italian families understood something important. They couldn't beat Bumpy with force because Bumpy had something they could never buy: absolute loyalty of an entire community.
Every doorman, every cab driver, every short-order cook in Harlem would die before they gave up Bumpy Johnson, so they decided to use the system. If they couldn't kill Bumpy in the streets, they'd let the state do it for them. That's where Frank DiMaggio came in. June 2nd, 1956, 3 weeks before the arrest. DiMaggio sat in the back room of Sal's Deli on Mulberry Street, across from a man whose name he didn't know.
The man wore an expensive suit and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise his voice. "We need Johnson out of the picture," the man said, sliding an envelope across the table. "Not dead. That would create a martyr. We need him in prison. A long sentence, federal if possible." DiMaggio opened the envelope. Inside was $15,000 in cash and a file. The file contained witness statements, account numbers, and enough manufactured evidence to put Bumpy away for 20 years. "This is solid?" DiMaggio asked. "The witnesses will testify. The numbers will check out. All you have to do is make the arrest." "Why me?" The man smiled. "Because you're already on our payroll, Frank, and because you're hungry. This arrest makes your career. Captain by 40. Chief by 50. All you have to do is put the cuffs on one man." DiMaggio should have asked more questions. He should have wondered why the mob was working so hard to frame a man they could have simply killed.
But $15,000 has a way of silencing questions. When do you want it done? 3 weeks. June 23rd. Arrest him in public. On 125th Street, broad daylight. We want everyone to see that nobody is untouchable. The plan was simple. DiMaggio would approach Bumpy with a warrant, arrest him in front of his own community, and demonstrate that even the king of Harlem couldn't escape the law. The public humiliation would break the myth. The trial would put him away. And with Bumpy gone, Harlem would be ripe for the taking. What the Genovese family didn't know, what DiMaggio couldn't have guessed, was that Bumpy Johnson had ears everywhere, including inside that deli on Mulberry Street. What nobody knew, what the Italian families never understood, was that Bumpy Johnson didn't just run Harlem. He had cultivated relationships across all 5 boroughs. And one of those relationships was with a dishwasher at Sal's Deli named Marcus Webb.
Marcus was nobody to the mob, just another invisible black man washing dishes in the back. They didn't notice him. They didn't watch their words around him. And they definitely didn't know that 5 years earlier, Bumpy had paid for Marcus's mother's hospital bills when she was dying of cancer. Loyalty like that can't be bought. It can only be earned. The same night as DiMaggio's meeting, Marcus was in Bumpy's office above Small's Paradise, reporting everything he'd heard. "June 23rd, Marcus said. On a 125th. They want it public. Want to humiliate you." Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. He could have disappeared. Could have left town for a few months, let the heat die down. That's what most men would have done. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men would have done. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. "They want public." Bumpy said, a smile crossing his face. "Then public they'll get. Over the next run.
Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He organized. Bumpy called in every favor. He met with community leaders, business owners, church ministers, and block captains. He explained what was coming. He told them that on June 23rd, a corrupt cop was going to try to arrest him with false evidence manufactured by the Italian mob. He told them this was about more than Bumpy Johnson. This was about whether Harlem would bow to outside pressure. And then he asked them a question. "When that cop comes for me, will you be there?" The response was unanimous. Meanwhile, Bumpy made other moves. He reached out to his contacts in the press, black newspapers, progressive journalists, anyone who would listen. He gave them DiMaggio's name, his history of brutality, his connections to organized crime. He told them where to be on June 23rd and what to watch for.
He also made one more call to a city councilman named Harold Pierce, one of the only black elected officials in New York at the time. Pierce owed Bumpy for bankrolling his campaign. Now it was time to collect. "I need you at 25th and Lenox on June 23rd at 2030 in the afternoon," Bumpy said. "Bring a camera crew if you can." What happens that day is going to change things. By June 22nd, Bumpy had everything in place. The trap wasn't set for him. The trap was set for Officer Frank DiMaggio.
June 23, 1956, 2:47 p.m., 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. DiMaggio spotted Bumpy outside of Mickey's barber shop, exactly where his informant said he'd be. The cop straightened his uniform, checked his service weapon, and walked toward his target with the confidence of a man who had no idea what he was walking into. "Ellsworth Johnson," DiMaggio announced, using Bumpy's legal name. "You're under arrest. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Bumpy didn't move, didn't flinch.
He just looked at DiMaggio with those calm, steady eyes. "On what charges?" "Racketeering, conspiracy, tax evasion. I've got enough to put you away for 20 years. DiMaggio reached for Bumpy's wrist. That's when he noticed the silence. 105th Street was never quiet. It was one of the busiest intersections in Harlem. Car horns, street vendors, children playing, radios blaring from open windows. But in the span of 60 seconds, every sound had stopped. DiMaggio turned around.
300 people had materialized from nowhere. They poured out of barber shops, grocery stores, and apartments. They came from the subway entrance and the bus stops. Old men in their Sunday suits, young mothers with babies on their hips, teenagers who'd been shooting dice on the corner, war veterans still wearing their medals. They formed a perfect circle around DiMaggio and Bumpy, and every single one of them was staring at the cop, not with fear, with absolute, unwavering resolve.
DiMaggio's hand moved toward his gun. A voice from the crowd called out, "Touch that weapon and you won't make it to the corner." The cop looked for his backup. They were 2 blocks away, but 2 blocks might as well have been 2 miles. No car could get through this crowd. No reinforcements could reach him in time. That's when he saw the cameras. 3 news crews had set up on the opposite corner. Reporters were scribbling in notebooks. A man in a suit, Councilman Harold Pierce, was speaking into a microphone. Bumpy spoke calmly, but his voice carried across the silent street. "You sure you want this smoke?" DiMaggio's face went white. He understood now. This wasn't an arrest, it was a trap, and he was the one caught in it. "I know about Sal's Deli," Bumpy continued, his voice still calm. "I know about the 15,000. I know about the manufactured evidence. And by tomorrow morning, every newspaper in this city is going to know too." Bumpy took a step closer to DiMaggio, close enough that only the cop could hear his next words. "You came here to humiliate me in front of my people. Now look around. Look at what my people are willing to do for me. Ask yourself, does anyone in that precinct love you enough to stand between you and 300 angry souls?
Does anyone in the Genovese family care if you make it home tonight?" DiMaggio's hands were shaking now. Sweat poured down his face. "You have 2 choices," Bumpy said. "You can try to arrest me. Maybe you'll get the cuffs on. Maybe your backup will arrive. Maybe you'll get out of Harlem alive. That's a lot of maybes, officer." "Or," DiMaggio whispered, "or you drop that warrant. You turn around. You walk out of my neighborhood, and you never come back." DiMaggio looked at the crowd,
at the cameras, at Bumpy's calm, unblinking eyes, and he realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was powerless. All his authority, all his backup, all his connections, none of it mattered here. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was the law. The warrant fell from DiMaggio's hand. It drifted to the ground like a dead leaf. And then, without a word, Officer Frank DiMaggio reached up and unpinned his badge. He stared at it for a long moment.
Then he dropped it on top of the warrant. He turned and walked away. The crowd parted to let him through. Not out of respect, but out of contempt. He wasn't worth touching. He wasn't worth their anger anymore. As DiMaggio reached the edge of the crowd, someone started clapping. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, 300 people were applauding. Not for the cop's departure, for Bumpy Johnson's victory.
Bumpy picked up the badge, examined it briefly, then tossed it to a young boy standing nearby. "Something to remember," Bumpy said. Today, Harlem reminded them who we are. Word of that afternoon spread through New York's underworld like wildfire. By nightfall, every mobster from Brooklyn to the Bronx had heard the story. A cop had tried to arrest Bumpy Johnson in the middle of Harlem. An entire neighborhood had stood up. The cop had dropped his badge and walked away.
The 5 families called an emergency meeting the next morning. The room was tense. "We paid $15,000 for nothing," one boss complained. DiMaggio was supposed to be reliable. Vito Genovese, the man who'd orchestrated the plan, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that nobody expected. "We leave Harlem alone." The room erupted. They'd invested years trying to crack that neighborhood. They couldn't just walk away. Genovese raised his hand. The room went silent. 300 people surrounded that cop. 300, and they would have torn him apart. Not for money, not for fear, for Bumpy Johnson. He paused. "We can buy cops. We can buy judges. We cannot buy that kind of loyalty. Harlem belongs to Bumpy Johnson. Trying to take it from him is just going to cost us more money and more men." It was the first time the Italian mob had ever backed down without a single shot being fired. As for DiMaggio, he was finished. The newspapers published everything: his connections to the mob, his history of brutality, the manufactured evidence. Within a month, he was indicted on corruption charges. He served 4 years in federal prison. Last anyone heard, he was working as a security guard in Florida. A broken man who'd learned the hard way that some territories can't be conquered. The story of June 23, 1956 became legend in Harlem. Grandparents told it to their grandchildren. It wasn't just a story about beating a corrupt cop. It was a story about what happens when a community stands together, about power that can't be bought or bullied. Bumpy Johnson proved something that day that most people still don't understand. Real power isn't about guns or money or political connections. Real power is having people who believe in you so deeply that they'll stand in the street and dare the world to move them. DiMaggio walked into Harlem with a warrant and a badge. He walked out with nothing. And Bumpy? He went back to protecting his neighborhood, one day at a time, until his heart gave out in 1968. But here's the thing. He died still king. Still untouchable, still loved by the people he'd spent his whole life protecting. Look, if this story got you feeling something, do me a favor, hit that like button real quick. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for?
We're dropping these Bumpy Johnson stories every week, and trust me, the next one is even crazier. Drop a comment and let me know.